Answer the false emperor!
Hi everyone, and welcome to this final part of the Abaddon painting series from Promethean Paints. In this final part we're going to be focusing on Drach, his sword, doing some final touches, some highlighting on the armour, and yeah, that's about it really to get this model finished. I've left the sword till last because we're going to be using the airbrush on it, but first of all, what you can see there in that pot of glowing white is my white ink mix that I've pre-made, which is Vallejo White Ink mixed with 2 parts water and 1 part contrast medium from Citadel. And what I did, I just made a big batch of that and then stuck it into one of the contrast medium pots, which means I haven't got to keep making it all the time. It's always to hand. Always give it, I'll put a couple of magnets in the bottoms. You can use little ball bearings just to give it a good shake up, because the white can settle towards the bottom because it's quite heavy pigmented. So I always give the bottle a good shake. Or you can just make it on the fly. So yeah, that's Vallejo White Ink, 1 drop of that, a couple of drops of water and a drop of contrast medium just to make a nice flowing white ink contrast type mix. And what I'm doing on the sword is there's little mouths and eyes, all the dead souls that have been dragged into the sword. So with the white ink I'm just putting a little bit of paint onto the brush and just pushing the paint into those holes so that it just flows nicely into all of those gaps. And I'll be doing the same with the chaos symbol on his left shoulder and the sort of chaos symbol on his left sort of wrist armour that he's got there, and that will give us the base sort of real glow for our airbrush just to go over in a minute. But yeah, just work around the sword. All we're doing here is just filling in almost pure white those mouths that are around the shoulder pad and the chaos symbol on his shoulder and the mouths on Drach's sword and a little bit on his wrist. Right, now's the fun part. With the Vallejo White Ink straight into the airbrush, I'm just using that's a cheap £30 airbrush from Amazon. It's not an expensive one, it's a really cheap one, and all I've done there is just put some white ink directly into it, and now with gentle sprays from the airbrush, just giving a sort of halo effect now to all of those bright points. So pointing the nozzle of the airbrush in the central points of those mouths, and then just giving it a couple of sprays so that you get a natural halo effect around your bright points. And what's that's doing is it's just giving natural gradient to when we add the fluorescent colour over the top of that, it will give a natural gradient from really, really bright to dark. Really simple to do, and I said you don't need an expensive airbrush to do this. A little bit of practice on some old models will help, because sometimes the triggers can be a little bit not as good on these cheaper airbrushes, but you certainly don't need to go out and spend hundreds of pounds on an airbrush at first to get these effects straight away. Okay, give your airbrush a good clean out, and then with some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red straight in. One little drop of water is all you need, just to let it flow a bit better. And then again, gentle pressure on the nozzle now with the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. Just cover the entire sword now, all of the white, all of the dark, just cover the whole lot in the red, and his shoulder pad and his wrist sort of piece of armour. Obviously take care, you don't want to cover too much of the model. You could cover it with some airbrush putty, or just keep that arm off the model if you wanted to, but it stands away quite enough really that I was quite confident that you could still have the arm glued to the model. You didn't really need to take it off. But yeah, don't apply this too thick. Let it just settle down, almost like you're putting a contrast paint on through the airbrush. A few sprays, move away, come back. A few coats, give it time to dry between each one, and then work around. You can get a little bit of overspray on some of that armour that we've got, not too much. Just focus it on where you've just painted on the white ink, and that'll be, once you've done a couple of coats of this, that's the sort of airbrush work done, and we'll be back to brush work. After I've smashed him about the table a little bit, just going back to that white ink mix that we've previously made, and I'm just reintroducing some of those bright points again. And so I've got a really small brush now. This is like a 00 Artist Opus. You could still use an O size, but yeah, you sort of artificial size brushes here because you don't want too much paint on. And what I'm doing now, I'm sort of glazing back in that white. So starting from the sort of central points of those arrows for that chaos symbol, the sort of spikes, and pushing it down to the where I want it to be brightest. So that's all we're doing here, is introducing the white to show the bright points. Then we'll be going over that again with the brush with another colour. So what we're just doing here is just reintroduce those bright areas using that white ink mix. Not too much, leave some of that older red showing, because without darks you can't have your lights. So a little bit in each of the mouths, and we'll be going over that again in a fluorescent colour. Okay, before we just go back over this in another fluorescent, got some white on the palette there. This is just the AK Intense White, and I'm just going to introduce some edge highlighting. I'm not going to edge highlight the entire sword here. I'm going to focus the edge highlights on those areas where I've got the glow. So just towards the bottom there, at the very top of the sword as well, doing the edge highlight not only on the two left and right edges, but also on that central edge, just doing a little highlight there. Don't forget the back of the sword as well, but not 100% edge highlight, probably only about 20% I'm edge highlighting, just in little bits here and there where I want the bright points to be. Right, once that's dry, get some AK Fluorescent Orange, and now we're just going to quite simply, where we've done that white, paint over it now in this fluorescent orange Try not to paint over any of the red, maybe just a little bit over that red, but mainly focus on where you just done that white. Now go over it with the fluorescent orange, and what that will do is that will just massively increase the intensity of the glow from a dark red to bright orange. So those bright orange points are where the heat intensity is at its most. Don't forget to do your edge highlighting again, so use this paint. It's not watered down, it's straight out of the pot. Just apply a little bit on the brush there that you can see, and just go over those white areas. Sometimes it might take 2 or 3 coats just to cover the white, but always put the paint on and then leave it to dry, because it will gain intensity as it dries. Give it a couple of minutes to dry and then see if you like it or not. If not, just apply a little bit more. Okay, this next stage, I just want to add some source lighting onto the armour and around his hand. So what I'm doing here is just doing little edge highlights of where I want the glow from the sword to be bouncing back light, which is going to be sort of around the tips of the shoulder pads, a little bit on the sword hilt, on his wrist guard, and a little bit on his hand at the front. And then once I've applied that white, going to put a little bit of the green stuff, well, fluorescent red on the palette, and then just go over the top of it in that fluorescent red. And what that will do is that will just make it look like the light is bouncing off some of those darker parts of the armour. Right, and we've got one final stage to really make those colours pop. Put a little bit of AK Tenebrous Grey onto your palette, and we're just going to dry brush it. So I've got a really small dry brush there. Got as much of paint off as I could, and then we're just going to dry brush on some of that Tenebrous Grey over the raised parts of those faces and mouths, over any naturally dark areas that you've created with your airbrush. Just intensify that darkness with this Tenebrous Grey. Just remember to get as much off the brush as you possibly can. Less is more here, and certainly less on the brush is more. I'd much rather do 3, 4, 5 attempts at getting the dry brush on than putting too much on and just ruining the whole thing. So take your time on this and just bring in some of those dark areas, because what you're doing here is you're creating huge contrast between your brightest brights and your darkest darks, and you're going to have darks right next to brights, which will then really make them stand out, give some life and a bit more flavour and depth to your sword. So it's front and back, and just add a little bit of this Tenebrous Grey. Also do a little bit of this dry brushing over his shoulder pad, just to darken down the shoulder pad and to catch the skull and the edges of the chaos symbol that's on his arm. Right, and we're almost done now. We've just got one final little bit to do, and that's the Eye of Horus on his right shoulder. And for this, what I'm doing is I've going to base coat the whole thing in wine red. And we're just going to use the same principles that we've been doing for his glowing areas, the red glow. So base coat it all in wine red. It's a bit hard to see, the talon's in the way. That's the whole eye in the wine red. And then in the centre point of the eye, just use the AK blood red in the central point, and then do a little dot of white, like a little line of white, and then use your Green Stuff World fluorescent red, and then a little dub of orange, fluorescent orange on the top of that. So exactly the same principles as the glowing colour. We're just making the, like, imagine it's an eye, so the outside of the eye is the dark red, the inner part of the eye is where it gets hotter and hotter and hotter as it gets to the middle, and when it's going to be the fluorescent orange colour. So the same principles we've done with the glowing, we're just going to do on the eye. And then once all that is dry, I'll make a wash of the Tenebrous Grey, and then just apply that wash on the outsides of the eye, just to create a bit of a natural gradient and darken those edges down, make it look a little bit more spherical in that shoulder pad. And then that's pretty much it. We've got one optional step left just at the very end. well, before that optional step, told a little fib. Before that optional step, what I'm doing is just some final highlights with your pure white colour on the areas that would be catching the light it's most intense. Just adding little dabs of white onto those tops of the shoulder pads, some edge highlighting on the talons, a little bit on his leg, not too much, just very subtle. As I said, I wanted this grim dark feel to Abaddon, with just minimal highlights, but those highlights really standing out. So yeah, just a few dabs of white here and there just to bring out some of those highlights. And of course I've left this right to the end, these final highlights, as I wanted to see what happened with the model as we progressed through. I didn't know how much bounce lighting I was going to have with the sword effects. I didn't know if I was going to cover more of it, so I left this right until the end just so I could get a feel of the model and just to see where I wanted some of those highlights to be left. Okay, the final step we're going to be covering is we're going to be using some AK Wargame Enamel Orange Fluorescent. This stuff is insanely bright. Give the bottle a really good shake. You get tons of it in the little pot, and with a tiny little bit on the brush, just apply this into the bottom sections of the mouths. Honestly, don't put too much of this on. It is so intense. If you put too much on, it looks horrible. So just tiny little amounts on the brush, tiny little dots in, and this grows with intensity the more it dries. So after about 15-20 minutes, it'll be double as bright as when you initially put it on. This stage is optional, don't have to do it. I just wanted to do it because I just love this final feel. That it gives that sort of sword, a lot more intense orange. And then just to wash it out, I use some AK odorless thinners. I've got 2 bottles of this, one that I use for washing the brushes, the other that I use to help thin down any sort of enamel washes that I use, or oil based washes that I want to create. With his base, all I did for his base was just apply a few enamel washes of AK rusts, different sort of colours over it, and then some Gamer Grass Tufts super glued onto the top. Obviously base him however you wish, and that's him done. So I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Lots of cool techniques that we covered off. All in all, it's probably half a day, 3/4 of a day's work to get him painted up to this level. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed. Like and subscribe as always, and happy painting, my fellow heretics.